trying to create. And I also just want to mention that I actually have a different meaning of the word thinking than usually it's considered to be. In my meaning, when I use the word thinking, I don't just mean something mental and passive. I mean something that has a number of ingredients, crucial ingredients or elements, and one of those is acting. So what I'm proposing is there's no separation between acting and thinking. They're all part of the one process. It's interesting that 2,500 years ago, Plato said, the only way we can discover if what we know is right or not right is to act on what we know. So I'm delighted then to have our two speakers here, and I'm very well aware that both of them are very, very deep thinkers, but thankfully they are also people of action and have a deep awareness of the importance of action. So to start off introducing them, I will just read out the following introduction to Ray McGovern at first. I know Ray longer than I know Professor Roberts, so that's why maybe I will talk about Ray first. Ray McGovern was a CIA analyst from 1963 to 1990, serving under 7 different United States presidents. In the 1980s, Ray chaired national intelligence estimates and prepared the president's daily brief. He received the Intelligence Commendation Medal at his retirement, returning it in 2006 to protest the CIA's involvement in torture during the Iraq War. In 2003, Ray co-founded Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. He has been interviewed on numerous media and has had numerous articles published. So far, his life has been so extraordinary that I think there should be a documentary made about it. And then to mention something of Professor Roberts' history and background. Geoffrey Roberts is an historian, biographer, and political commentator, a renowned specialist in Russia and Soviet foreign and military policy, and an expert on Stalin and the Second World War. His books have been translated into numerous languages, and he has won many awards for his academic achievements. He is Emeritus Professor of History at University College Cork and a member of the Royal Irish Academy. Professor Roberts was head of University Cork School of History from 2009 to 2014. One of the things that I notice about practically every event that ever occurs is that it invariably involves a process, and that process will tend to have a beginning and then, like as in a war, a breakout at some point. And the time difference between the beginning and the breakout can actually be quite considerable. So what I want then, the first question I want to ask our speakers is, why did Putin decide to invade Ukraine? And on this question of historical process, I would like then to address that question, first of all, to Professor Roberts, and then Ray McGovern can also give his comments. So the time we can then get started on this exciting conversation between these two men who agree on much and disagree also on certain elements.
Historical events are the result of a historical process. And as a historian, or a particular kind of historian, my perspective is that the most important thing about the historical processes leading to historical outcomes, historical events, is the process of reasoning that leads to action, that creates the events. Because it's people. We make history. We make the events in the human world. They're the outcome of our actions. They're the outcome of our thinking. So as far as understanding the process leading to the outbreak of the Russo-Ukrainian war in February 22, the most important thing we have to understand is the process of reasoning that led to the action that created war. Fundamentally, President Vladimir Putin's decision for war, his decision to invade Ukraine. Now, if you follow the Western press, Western media, Western politicians, their explanation, their analysis of Putin's reasoning leading to the invasion of Ukraine is this: he's an imperialist, he's an expansionist, he's a dictator, and he launched an aggressive war against Ukraine as part of his imperialist project to recreate or extend a Russian empire. And not only that, if he gets his way in Ukraine, if he wins the war in Ukraine, then other countries may come into the firing line of Russian imperial expansion. So that's the Western political media view, and that view is just, well, it's not just it's just propaganda. It's wrong. I'm not even convinced that even everyone who actually spouts those kind of views actually really sincerely believes it. Some of them do, I'm sure, but basically it's a propagandistic view of Putin's motivation for war. And the most important point to understand in order to understand this well, we need to see it from Putin's point of view, from the Russian perspective. And from Putin's point of view, from the Russian perspective, and by that I mean the great majority of Russian people, this war is not a war of aggression. It's a defensive war. It's a defensive war provoked by Western and Ukrainian actions. It's a war designed to protect Russia's security. It's a war that has developed into, because of the way the whole thing has panned out, into a war for the very existence of Russia, for Russia's future as an independent state, as a great power in the world, as a great civilization. So from Putin's point of view, from the Russian perspective, it's not a war of aggression. It's a defensive war. That's the first point, crucial point. From Russian perspective, Putin's perspective, it's a war of defense. The second point is that why did Putin take the decision to launch that war of defense in February 22 in the form of this invasion of Ukraine? Why did he do it then rather than before? Or why didn't he like do it at some point in the future? Okay, so the explanation for the time is that by the time we get to February 22, Putin has been engaged in a process of diplomatic negotiation with Ukraine and with the West. And he's come to the conclusion that that process is going nowhere, that the West and Ukraine is not willing to negotiate a settlement, to respond in a constructive way to various security proposals he's put on the table. And he's backed up this quite intense diplomatic effort at this time with building up his armed forces in Ukraine. So it's what some people call coercive diplomacy that he's engaged in. It's what I would call like militarized diplomacy, like diplomacy backed up by the threat of military power and the threat of military force. Right? He's come to the conclusion that his strong arm diplomacy isn't working, and the security issues for Russia are so great that it's necessary to take military action to actually launch this invasion. So that's what happens in February 22. Okay, the next point is this, is that what military action does he launch? Well, he launches what he calls a special military operation. Okay, so it's actually quite, the Russian attack on Ukraine, end of February 22, is quite a large-scale attack, a large-scale invasion, but it's not a full-scale war. It's a limited military operation. And it's a limited military operation for two reasons. Firstly and fundamentally, because Putin's goals are limited, right? And okay, again, the argument you find in the media is that Putin wanted to conquer the whole of Ukraine, destroy Ukraine as a state and a nation, occupy it. But that's not the case. What Putin was trying to achieve through this invasion was to force Ukraine and the West to actually negotiate seriously about Russian security. It was, I see it's been a kind of an extension or radicalization of this militarized diplomacy, which had been engaging in for several months. So it's a special military operation because the political goals are actually quite limited. It's a second special military operation for a second reason, which is the expectation, the calculation that the war is going to be a short war. Yeah, that Russian military power is quite rapidly going to be able to destroy or undermine Ukraine's armed forces, its military situation, and thereby force some kind of political and diplomatic resolution of Russia's conflict with Ukraine and the West, right? But that didn't happen. That was a major miscalculation. So Putin's intention.
Sorry, Geoff, can I just say also, at that point then, from what I understand, Ukraine and Russia were making an agreement, and then this situation that's reported that the White House instructed Boris Johnson to go to Ukraine and prevent Ukraine from making that agreement. Is that a reality?
Yes. Okay. Before I get to that point specifically, so it's a defensive war. It's a war that's primarily about Russian security, fundamental issues of Russian security, right? It's also about protecting ethnic Russians in Ukraine or bordering Ukraine or in the rebel territories of the Donbass, Donetsk and Lugansk. Okay? It's about protecting them or protecting Russian leaning or Russian identifying Ukraine. So it is primarily about security, the war, the invasion, but this other factor of protecting compatriots, as Putin sees it, is also very important. And the other factor, of course, protecting Russian compatriots shapes the character of the war that actually develops, right? Including, and we'll come to this later, I think, what Russia's war and peace aims are. But we'll come to that point now. So it's okay. So it's a security war. It intends to be a short war, but it turns into a long war. But it turns into a long war not because of Putin's choice or Russia's choice, although they're certainly prepared to fight a long war. They have fought a long war and they will continue to do so. It turns into a long war because the West turns the Russo-Ukrainian war, the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, into a proxy war between the West and Russia, a NATO-Russia proxy war. And it's that Western proxy war that turned this, what could have been a short war, into a long war. Why do I say that? Well, without Western support, this war would have been over months ago. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, tens of thousands of Russians would still be alive. The country wouldn't have been half devastated as the state is now, and maybe even on the verge of collapse. So it's the Western proxy war that has prolonged the war and continues to prolong the war. And what do I mean when I say proxy war? Well, it's not just arms and money. In a way, that's the least of it. It's intelligence information. It's targeting. It's organisation and funding of foreign mercenaries. It's engaging in sabotage. I can't think of any kind of like conflict or war that you would put the label proxy on, where you've had such extensive involvement and intervention, everything except actually getting directly involved in the war itself. And another important crucial point to make here, again, think of it from a Russian point of view, is that this Western proxy war has resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of Russian soldiers. That's the reality of it. This proxy war, okay, the country that has suffered most of this Western proxy war is Ukraine, but Russia itself has suffered in terms of its own military casualties, and also, of course, the space in which the war has been fought, still being fought in eastern and southern Ukraine, has been devastated, destroyed, wiped out. In many cases, turned into a complete wasteland. Right? That's that, and territories, by the way, which Russia occupies or intends to occupy and will become part of Russia. That's the price of this Western proxy war. Okay, but then finally, just go. I'll shut up. But you made the point. You asked the point about peace negotiations. Yeah. So not long, a few weeks after the war started. So war starts end of February 22. Already by March, mid to late March, there's actual diplomatic interaction, contact, negotiations. Talk going on between Ukraine and Russia. Starts off in Minsk, and then the talks stutter back and forward, and but as these things all do. But then they shift and continue to Istanbul, and in Istanbul in April 2022, the two sides, Russia and Ukraine, start to edge closer to some kind of agreement, an agreement which will lead to a ceasefire, an agreement which will lead to Ukraine giving up any idea of becoming a member of NATO. And again, that's another very important point. I mean, when we're discussing, the reasons for the war, the whole issue of NATO expansion is brought up. NATO expansion towards Russia's borders and how threatening Russia saw it. That's absolutely true. But it's not NATO expansion as such that I think provokes the war. It's NATO's expansion into Ukraine and its build-up of Ukraine militarily, right? That's what Putin and Russia sees as being most threatening, and that's what the war is all about. It's not really about halting or turning back NATO expansion into Eastern and Central Europe and to Russia's borders. That's not going to happen. That's not possible, right? But it is about halting the process of Ukraine becoming a member of NATO, being integrated into NATO's military structure. Okay, so the central part of the peace deal from the Russian point of view, and I'm talking about in the spring of 2022, is Ukraine's not going to be part of NATO. It's going to be a neutral state between NATO and Russia. It's not going to be a military threat to Russia. And also, another part of the peace deal is that Russia is going to gain some territory in the Donbass and on the Black Sea coastline, the land bridge to Crimea. Okay, so there's this deal, but this deal collapses, and it collapses because mainly because Ukraine withdraws from those negotiations and steps back, walks back from some preliminary agreements and understandings, draft documents that have been arrived at, right? That big question is why that happened. Now, I need to wear my historian hat and say we don't really have enough good evidence to come to any definite conclusions as to why those peace talks failed. But all the evidence we do have points to Western states, the United States. You mentioned Britain, but actually encourage, at least the very least, encouraging the Ukrainians to walk away from any peace deal with Russia and to fight the war, to continue fighting, to continue the war. And obviously with Western support. Now, some people say, well, it was, the West, NATO, the United States, Britain in particular, those two countries sabotaged those peace talks because they want the war to continue. They want this proxy war. They think they can win this proxy war. They think they can break Russia. They can break Russia economically, financially, and also through the war in Ukraine militarily. That argument might be right. I don't think we quite have enough evidence to conclude that definitively. And also the question in my mind about this issue is this: I'm not so sure how serious the Ukrainians were about these negotiations. I'm not certain about that, or at least some Ukrainians. Some were, yeah. So the West, when it's like sabotaging or putting pressure on Ukraine not to do this peace deal with Russia, might very well have been pushing at a very open door as far as the Ukrainians is concerned. So I think always, okay, we need to allow the possibility for some Ukrainian agency here. Yeah. Yeah. So it might be that the fundamental decision to not to do this peace deal, to continue to fight the war, was a Ukrainian decision. That might well be the case. But of course, it's a Ukrainian decision that's predicated on Western support, massive Western support for its war effort. And to make the point I made previously, is that without Western support for Ukraine militarily and every other way, this war would have ended months ago. It would have ended with a ceasefire, a peace agreement, something that very similar to what was agreed in Istanbul, the draft agreement in Istanbul, a very similar agreement. War would have been over. And in fact, I'll even go as far as say this. This is my final point. At this point, Eddie, is that the same deal that was available to Ukraine in spring 22 is still on the table, except that the deal, because of the way the war has progressed, the deal would involve Ukraine losing a lot more territory, conceding a lot more territory than it would have had to have conceded in the spring of 1992. So that a similar kind of deal is still on table. I think just about. But of course, depending on what happens in the war next, and maybe we'll come back to this topic later, that may not be.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Everything you're saying from the perspective of a lot of people will have heard of a completely different narrative of what's been going on. As a matter of fact, the vast majority of people will have heard a different narrative. So at a later point in this, I know we're going to maybe have a look at the media and what's happened here. So thank you very much for that summary of how it actually happened and has continued to happen. So maybe, Ray, you might like then to come in.
This attack on Ukraine was provoked, okay? Now, I like to look at historical sources, and I think I'll start off with this before I show some slides. We have, courtesy of WikiLeaks, a cable from Embassy Moscow. Now, it's authentic. Everything WikiLeaks puts up is authentic, and I happen to know this is authentic because if I've seen one cable from Embassy Moscow, I've probably seen thousands during my career as chief of Soviet foreign policy branch at the CIA. This is what it says. Bill Burns, that is the U.S. ambassador to Russia, was called into the foreign ministry by Sergei Lavrov, foreign minister, just newly appointed in those days. The year is 2008. The date is February 1. And this is William Burns' account. He says in his title, "Niet" means niet. Russia's NATO enlargement red lines. That's how we reported it back to the United States. With respect to NATO enlargement, particularly to Ukraine, it remains an emotional and a neuralgic issue and strategic policy considerations are important. Here's the kicker. Here's what Lavrov said to our ambassador. With respect to Ukraine, we are fearful that this issue will split the country, the issue being whether NATO is able to accumulate Ukraine. It will split the country into, this is a quote, leading to violence or even, some claim, civil war, which would force Russia to decide whether we have to intervene, period, end quote. Now, that was October 1st, 2008. 2 months later, NATO decided at a summit, Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. Declarative voice, okay? Will become members of NATO, okay? So now, fast forward just 15 years, and you have William Burns in a new position. He's now head of the CIA. And whereas Sergei Lavrov told us, told Bill Burns, on the 1st of February 2008, that this would provoke a civil war and possibly would force Russia to decide whether to intervene or not, end quote. Well, hello. Now Bill Burns says the Russian invasion of Ukraine was unprovoked. Unprovoked. So now Bill Burns is almost as old as I am, you know, but can you reason? Can you believe that he forgot what he was told? I don't think so. He's become a cog in the wheel and part of the multimedia campaign, about which we'll talk a little bit later. Now, there is one aspect that Geoff and I disagree on, and it's a minor aspect, considering the unprovoked nature of this war and other calculations that Jeffrey has expounded on so well. And that is, well, did Putin have any other options? I mean, hello, he does this special military operation. It's limited in nature. I think that he wanted to get the Ukrainians to negotiate seriously. He got that done in 6 weeks, but all of a sudden, boom, it fell down, right? So did he have any other options that time? And so what I'm going to do, because we sort of promised you a little dialogue on this, I'm going to show a couple of slides here that will sort of represent my view as to the fact that Putin had run out of options, that he had no other choice, that there were no other choices other than the one he made, given the fact that he's president of a country who is seeing an existential threat and needs, in the first instance, to fulfill his duty of defending his country. And so that's what he was provoked into doing. Okay, this is what was going on in Donetsk and Lugansk in February 2022. Most of the Ukrainian army is massed across from Donbass. That, incidentally, is one reason why it was such easy going for part of the Russian army to go through Kharkiv and surround Kiev. Kiev really wasn't defended. They didn't expect that kind of attack. So let's look at February 16. Now, if you look at the graph, I hope you could see it well. The 16th is the third bar graph from the left, and it shows that there was a geometric increase in explosions, they call it. Now, these data are from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, okay? A nonpartisan data, okay? So you could see that on the 16th of February, there was a great increase. Oh, the 17th, even more. Whoa, the 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st, and 22nd. So what are we saying here? We're saying that the Ukrainian army was shelling mostly civilians, because that's what most was in Donbass, in a geometric increase, a big uptick, as people like to say, starting on February 16th. So the invasion was February 24th, right? So this 16th, And all the while, the bulk of the Ukrainian army is massed near Donbass. I'll start talking to it.
Yeah, I might get it up then.
On the 21st of February, here he goes. Putin lists his grievances. It was a very angry speech, almost an hour. And what he says, in short, is Kiev is, quote, trying to orchestrate a blitzkrieg in Donbass. You all know what a blitzkrieg is. He points out that there are almost 4 million Russian speakers, people of Russian stock, in the Donbass, in Donetsk and Lugansk. He notes that the the Security Council approved these Minsk agreements. They were not honored by the West. We could talk later about why that happened, but both Angela Merkel from Germany, well, I'll go to the next slide for that. So what Putin says, hey, it's a long overdue decision, but I've made it. And I'm going to recognize the independence of these two republics, and we're going to sign defense treaties with them. So 2 days later, 23rd of February, Donetsk and Lugansk sign these treaties. They invoke the treaties and say, look, we need help. On the 24th, the next day, Putin invokes Article 51 of the UN Charter, and he sends troops in. We can talk about Article 51 a little bit later if you wish, but that's what he does to say, this is what we're doing. Bear in mind, Putin is trained not only as an intelligence analyst or operative, but also as a lawyer, okay? Now, why do I fast forward to June 28, 2023? Well, because by then, Hollande of France, Merkel of Germany, and Poroshenko of Ukraine have all admitted Minsk, Minsk, that was just a delaying tactic. We engaged the Russians so that we could build up Ukrainian forces with good training and NATO-style weapons, and that's what we used the Minsk process for. So Lavrov is just saying, yeah, they've confessed now that all they did was, in Lavrov's words, pour weapons into Ukraine. And he says something that I think Geoff will agree with. If the Minsk agreements were implemented, there would have been no need for the special military operation. The role of the United States in the Minsk agreements, well, you need to look on France and Germany as vassals of the United States in this imbroglio, and they still are. Okay, this captures Angela Merkel on the left, Putin in the middle there, and Hollande from France on the right. I'm going to leave it to you, audience, to decide what caption belongs to reflect what Putin may have been thinking at that time. Okay, now I'm going to switch gears a little bit. I'm going to explore a new subject, but it has very much to do with Putin's decision. We've already talked about the buildup against Lugansk and Donetsk. We've talked about how Putin and Lavrov felt they were diddled, to use an expression from the Bronx. And we've talked about how they saw their choices. Now, missiles near Russia, missiles near US. Oh, I'm talking about the missiles in Cuba. They were there in Cuba. John Kennedy felt an existential threat. He was a nuclear-powered country, and he told Khrushchev, you take those missiles out or else. I'm having a little thing here in my slide. If you could get rid of that, that'd be great. So what's the story here? Putin on the 21st of December now, so weeks before January, he's saying, look, he's addressing his very top generals and admirals. They have 4 stars to sit in on this, okay? Defense Minister Shoigu is there. He says, look, these MK-41 launchers that are already in place, already operational in Romania, and are about to be operational in Poland, you know, we don't know what's in those capsules because they're hidden. But if ballistic missiles, they could reach us in 7 to 10 minutes, or even 5 minutes if they're hypersonic missiles. Well, then Putin says this, and this is, please pay attention to this. If the U.S. does not have hypersonic missiles yet, but we know when they'll have them. They will supply them to Ukraine. Whoa, okay. This is a map, but we're not going to dwell on it, but you can see the emplacements that already exist, and they're both operational now. In Poland on the top, in Romania on the bottom, and you can see a putative emplacement near Kiev in Ukraine. Now, so you'll see from Poland, it'll be a normal run-of-the-mill generic ballistic missile would take 9 minutes to get from their place in Poland to Moscow. From Romania, it would take about 10 minutes. From somewhere in Ukraine, look at Ukraine, it's a lot closer than Poland or Romania. It would be 7 minutes. And what Putin also said, of course, was supersonic missiles or hypersonic missiles, 5 minutes. So put yourself in Putin's place. Do you want have only 5 minutes to decide whether you're under a nuclear attack and whether you should press the button to destroy the world? If I were him, I would not like this. Okay, now just for purposes of comparison, I asked a specialist to draw this map, which has to do with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And you can see that the SS-4s, the medium-range ballistic missiles, would take 12 minutes to reach Washington. It would take a little longer to reach Omaha, where our strategic air command was, but that was the same kind of danger. Suffice it to say that Kennedy saw that as an existential threat, and he moved. Actually, he did a lot of illegal things, like a blockade, amassing an invasion force ready to pounce on Cuba, like threatening nuclear war. Okay, he was serious. Khrushchev, the Soviet leader at the time, said, well, nothing ventured, nothing gained. This is not an existential threat for us. So let's get those missiles out of there. So that's the way that was resolved. The point here is when a nuclear armed country sees an existential threat to its existence, which in this case, 12 minutes, 9 minutes to naval bases and so forth. Back in those days, 60 years ago, what nuclear arms countries do is they say, look, we will not tolerate that. And they force, in Kennedy's case, Khrushchev to back down. Okay, now what happened? Well, I just mentioned that on the 21st of December, Putin had complained about the emplacement of ballistic missiles in range of Moscow, and that they could be there in 5 minutes if they were hypersonic, and that the US would inevitably get hypersonic missiles. So, new hope? Yes. On the 30th of December, at Putin's initiative, Biden and he talked by phone. And the readout of this conversation said, Biden said to Putin, quote, Washington has no intention of deploying offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, end quote. Whew. Now, Yuri Ushakov, chief advisor to Putin, rejoiced. He said, wow, they're taking us seriously. They're understanding our concerns. As a matter of fact, he says, so this is one of the chief goals. Well, actually, in the draft treaty that they had given to the United States and to NATO, that concession embodied 5 of the 8 articles in those treaties. So it was a big deal. There was great rejoicing in Moscow on New Year's Eve. Next slide, please. So that was February 12th when Putin and Biden discussed this, and the readout indicated that, once again, Biden made that undertaking. Whoops, hopes dashed. February 12th. So January, you have December 30th, to February 12th. If my math is right, that's 2 weeks, right? Next conversation between Biden and Putin. The readout, Ushakov announces, sorry, folks, this is the follow-up call to what we discussed on December 30th. Quote, Biden did not really address the central key elements of Russia's initiatives, either with respect to non-expansion of NATO or non-deployment of strike weapon systems on Ukrainian territory. To these items, we have received no meaningful response. Now, just a little historical context here. This was not a secret that NATO expansion would be a big, big problem. And George Kennan, my idol as a Soviet Russian specialist, ambassador to Moscow, author of the containment process, when he heard that Bill Clinton was expanding NATO, despite the promise made to Gorbachev and Shevardnadze in February of 1990, not to expand NATO 1 inch to the east of East Germany. Despite that, Clinton was going to do that. And what George Kennan said, I'll just read the first sentence here. No, I'll read it both. Expanding NATO would be the most fateful era of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. This is from an op-ed in the New York Times. You could see Kennan's frustration. Now, he was a cold warrior to the bone. He was responsible for a lot of things that the CIA did after the war, for God's sake. He fancied this kind of covert activity, overthrowing governments and so forth. And yet he saw what this kind of move would mean. He's so frustrated that he adds in this op-ed, Biden did not really address, why, with all the hopeful possibilities engendered by the end of the Cold War, why should East-West relations become centered on the question of who would be allied with whom, and by implication against whom, in some fanciful, totally unforeseeable, and most improbable future military conflict? Well, 1997, it was sort of unforeseeable, but the natural result of Kennan's admonition that this would be the most fateful era American policy since World War II, that has been borne out by what has happened here. Now, Professor John Mearsheimer is he's cast as the dean of the Realist School of International Relations. Now, my career was spent in looking after facts and advising the President of the United States what the Russians were doing, why I thought they were doing it. Just facts, man, just the facts, okay? I didn't realize that I was part of the Realist School of International Relations. I mean, maybe that came later, but that's what I did. Day-to-day current intelligence. So I just want to remind people that Mearsheimer is not allowed to talk to any university in the United States. He's not allowed on any of the cable or other TV outlets, okay? Why? Because he had it right 8 years ago, September 2014. He got into the most prestigious journal, Foreign Affairs, quote, why the Ukraine crisis is the West's fault, the liberal delusions that provoked Putin. Now, let me just read this next one. The US and NATO now face a choice on Ukraine. They can continue their current policy, which will exacerbate hostilities with Russia and devastate Ukraine in the process. I repeat, and devastate Ukraine in the process. Or they can switch gears and work to create a prosperous but neutral Ukraine. September 2014. Now, when I asked John Mearsheimer what he thought about whether Putin had any options, I asked this at a public forum, and what he said is, I think that Putin with great reluctance, invaded Ukraine. I do not think he had any other options. He was deeply committed to the Minsk agreement because he wanted to shut down the conflict in Donbass so he would not have to invade. So I think the facts, call me a realist, call me part of the realist school of international relations, whatever that is, but that's what I think really happened. And it's a sub point to the major conclusion that this attack was provoked, whether it was whether he had any other options. Of course, honorable men can disagree, but my conclusion is that when push comes to shove, he had done everything he could. I agree with Mearsheimer saying that he tried to shut it down through the Minsk process and found out that it was being diddled. He's being deceived. And so he decided he had to limit this special military operation. Whether it was provoked or not, of course it was provoked. Whether it was illegal or not, that's an interesting question, and it's an open question. Now, I cite people like Richard Falk, the professor emeritus at Princeton who wrote the books that my fellow law school graduates read on international relations. And he says, now, Ray, look, there's a very tenable argument that Article 51 could be invoked in such circumstances. It's unsettled law. There are other views, of course, but I would submit that not only was the special military operation, if you wish, provoked, and I think I can prove it, but it may have been legal, okay? And just to accept the notion that it was unprovoked and illegal, well, that's a function of the media. And I'll close with this. I don't know about Ireland, but I suspect that most Irish citizens who follow the major media don't have an accurate rendering of what happened. And, I saw something just a day or two ago from a German parliamentarian, one of the few who has the guts to speak out. And what she said was, she talked about our duty. Es ist unsere Pflicht, nicht dumm zu machen und nicht dumm machen zu lassen. Okay, it means it's our first duty not to let ourselves be made dumb. Okay, dumb. It means the same in English as it means in German. And again, just one little quote here. What did Obama say about this? Well, he was asked to give offensive arms to Ukraine. He said, look, don't do stupid. And it was the words beginning with S. I'll just say, don't do stupid stuff, okay? He said, look, Ukraine is a core interest for Moscow in a way that it is not for the United States. And then he said this, sending arms to Ukraine would encourage the Ukrainians to think they could actually defeat the far more powerful Russians, period, end quote. So I would say that Obama seems to have been from the realist school of international relations, if you will. That's what he said. That was 2016. Biden was his vice president at that time. I just don't know why Biden didn't get it.
And Ray, you're in that you were just asking the question about Ireland. And you see, the extraordinary thing is all these facts you've outlined there and the information important information Geoffrey articulated, that's practically non-existent in the Irish media. John Mearsheimer has, as far as I'm aware, never been interviewed. The only person who has been, as far as I'm aware, trying to draw attention to the Irish public in the last 2 years or a year is Geoffrey. So most Irish people, I mean, from my perspective, one of the reasons I wanted to try and initiate this is because facts are what change people's minds. But if facts are censored, not only do people's minds not change, but false facts are often then substituted into that void. So it's been very interesting listening to both what both of you have so far shared. However, one thing I wondered about, and it's the narrative that most of us here in Ireland would be hearing, and probably in other countries too. Is Russia committing large-scale atrocities and genocide in Ukraine, regardless of whether they were provoked or not? What's your opinion on that?
Can I come in here? I want to answer the question you just posed immediately. I'll come back to that later. Yeah, it's not just me in Ireland. There have been other voices querying, challenging Western and Irish policy in relation to the war. I mean, I point in particular to Claire Daly, the Irish MEP. Now, many political differences with Claire about all kinds of things, but she's I fully support the position that she's taken on the war. And she's made some absolutely fantastic speeches, opposing the Western proxy war in Ukraine. Speeches which I think actually have had quite an impact internationally. Not so much of an impact in Ireland actually, but an impact actually. So it's not just. It's not just my voice, and of course, the reason I'm a historian. Like being a political commentator is not my day job. It's not my primary kind of interest or purpose in life. It's history that I do rather than contemporary politics. Although, having said that, I mean, I taught international relations, including realism and all that, for 25 years at UCC, and in fact, I'm a graduate, I'm postgraduate.
Yeah, but the thing is, there's a difference, Geoff. I just want to make a point here about a difference. And I've listened to Claire Daly, and very interesting, you see, speaking in the European Parliament, which she's a member of. But the difference is this. You see, it's easy for people to turn around then and say, well, she's just a sympathizer of Putin, and they make all sorts of extreme statements about people like her. But when somebody with your credentials as a historian comes along and speaks in the Irish media, then that's a very different thing. And that's why I want to speaking.
Sure, they say the same things about me, of course. But yeah, of course, the reason I've involved myself in this, current affairs discussion is obviously it's because of the intrinsic importance of the war. We shouldn't never lose sight of that fact. While this war goes on, we all face an existential threat. Humanity faces an existential threat, the greatest existential threat in the history of humanity. In terms of an expansion, an escalation, expansion of this war. And I'm not saying it's likely. I think it's actually very broad, but still. As John Mearsheimer likes to say, there's a non-trivial chance that there could be a catastrophic expansion of the current conflict. So we should never, ever lose sight of that. So that's been in the forefront of my mind when I've been involving myself in sometimes some quite nasty, political discussions about the war here in Ireland. But also I involve myself because I'm a Russian studies specialist. And I feel I have a professional obligation to make my views known, but not just make my views known. Obviously, I have a position on the war, and I'm going to come back to what some of the things that Ray said in just a second. But my main purpose in getting involved in public, same here. I want to try and inform people, inform the public debate, bring to bear my knowledge and scholarship, and my whole attitude and approach to this, which is about trying to be as objective, as fair, as evidence-based as I can, and to inform public opinion so people can make up their own mind, on an informed basis, what they think about Putin, what they think about the war, what they think about the Western position, or indeed what they think about Ireland's involvement in this conflict as well. But just coming back to Ray, I suppose okay, fundamentally myself and Ray are in agreement. Is that the war was provoked. It was provoked by NATO expansion towards Russia's borders, provoked by the failure to implement these now famous Minsk agreements, which would have resolved the internal domestic split within Ukraine and thereby stabilized external relations between Russia and Ukraine. It was above all provoked by NATO's de facto expansion into Ukraine and the build-up of Ukraine's armed forces, including the possibility, the danger that they were going to get some advanced weaponry, in due course, hypersonic missiles and so on. And it's also provoked by the course of Ukrainian domestic politics, the strident ultra nationalism in Ukraine and its hostility towards Russia, turning Ukraine into what Putin perceived as an anti-Russia that was prepared to make itself into a tool of Western interests directed against Russia. Yeah, so it was a provoked war. But I suppose my fundamental point of difference is this: is that it was provoked, but Putin didn't have to allow himself to be provoked. Yeah, he wasn't provoked for years and years and years when Russia is trying to implement the Minsk agreements as best it can, and he's being stymied. He's been stymied by the Kiev Ukrainians. He's also been stymied by Western passivity in relation to this. But he could have, I think, remained unprovoked for at least a bit longer. And this is really what the difference is that Putin saw the threat that was materializing on Russia's borders in the form of this NATO enclave in Ukraine as being a dire threat, a growing threat, an existential threat. And it was a threat that it was best that he dealt with now rather than putting off to the future, right? That was his position. So from his point of view, he felt he had to do what he did. Yes, and I agree with what Miss Summer said. I think it was a reluctant decision. I think it was a close decision. But when he does it, I have to think, well, do I agree with what he did? My response is, I understand what he did, but I don't agree with it because I don't think the threat that Russia was facing, as he saw it, had fully materialized, and it wasn't an immediate threat. It was a medium and long term threat, and I felt that then. This is in February, March 2022. I feel now, still in retrospect, there was a scope for Putin to continue his hardball diplomatic strategy and maybe get some pressure because the West did stymie stonewall against Russia's security proposals put forward in December 2021. But as Lavrov himself, as he said to Putin, they're not making any fundamental concessions in relation to Ukraine neutrality or in relation to NATO expansion. But look, they're talking to us about things they'd never talked to us before, including stuff to do with missile deployment. That's my kind of my view was that there was an alternative. The alternative was diplomacy. I think that was a view that was shared by other members of Putin's government. Obviously, not Putin himself. He had a different view, including Lavrov. But I also think that Putin's decision was, and it was a very risky, adventurous thing to do. A big decision, huge decision, was I think informed by what turned out to be a miscalculation that he could. A short, sharp military operation, limited war against Ukraine, could force some serious negotiations, right, and force some kind of acceptable peace haven. That turned out to be wrong. Turned out to be wrong because the Ukrainians and Ukraine's armed forces turned out to be much stronger, much more resilient than the Russians expected. But also, it fundamentally turned out to be wrong because of the West, because of Western recklessness. Right, and risk taking in terms of pursuing this proxy war with Russia. Okay, so just one more point, and then I'll mute myself. Is that a decision for war is the most critical, fundamental decision that can be taken from a moral and political view. And to justify decisions for war with all the consequences of the war itself and all the attendant dangers that go with invading, getting involved in a war, the bar for that decision making, in my view, has to be set very high. And I don't think I don't think that we'd reached a point in February 22 whereby we were above that bar of wars. But look, that's a speculative argument. I can't prove that. I don't know what might have happened. I'm just giving you my view of the situation, but also my view as a historian in terms of my knowledge of history and the possibilities that history shows us as to where negotiations can go even after an unpromising start.
And the expression of different views is crucially important anyway, which is tending not to happen worldwide. But Ray, you want to
may I jump
there? Yeah,
may I jump in here? Thanks, Jeffrey, for explicating a little bit more of your views. Let me just comment. Number one, I appreciate that you're a historian. You're a terrific historian. I mean, your record and your leadership in history has been terrific, not only on Joseph Stalin, but on others. What I'd like to do is set out the difference between a historian and an intelligence analyst, okay? There's a big difference. Now, we stick to the facts, okay? Now, I made a presentation, a major one, spelling out the Cuban Missile Crisis as compared to what Putin sees as the crisis of middle-range ballistic missiles in Romania and Poland. And I never used the word justified, and I never used the word I condone and there was a person in the chat who made a big thinker saying, oh, McGovern justifies in Putin's pocket, he's justifying the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, luckily, a psychiatrist whom I know chimed in and said, I watched McGovern's presentation twice. I never heard him say justified. I never heard him say unjustified or condoned or any. He didn't say, but he did array a whole bunch of facts. So your conclusion is in the eye of the beholder. Apparently, your mind assimilated all those indisputed facts and decided, well, they justified the invasion of Ukraine. That's you. That wasn't McGovern. So what I'm saying here is that intelligence analysts don't condone, we don't justify, we don't make any moral judgments. We set out the facts as I try to do, and it's up to historians and others to say, well, this was right or this was wrong. Now, in a more particular way, you said, Geoff, that Putin miscalculated. No, I think he calculated correctly. 6 weeks after he invaded, the Ukrainians came to terms and they worked out that agreement that, as you pointed out, was ultimately initialed in Istanbul. Neutrality for Ukraine and other things that could easily have been implemented right then and there. So from that point of view, I would argue that Putin he calculated, if I frighten the Ukrainians into thinking what could really happen to them, I surround Kiev and all, and maybe they'll come to, maybe we can work this out diplomatically. And that happened. It was Boris Johnson and the US and NATO said, no, this isn't about Ukraine. This is about confronting Russia. And that's why we have, since the 1st of April Fool's Day of all things, when that agreement was initialed, until now with this terrible carnage. So that's one thing that I think, at the same time that Putin initialed this, he withdrew those troops from Kiev. Oh, people know that? People should know that. Two more small points, okay? When you get to be my age, sometimes you forget 2 of the 3 points you want to make. And so I plead my age on this one.
Yeah, let me just come back at Ray just a little bit. Yeah, Putin almost got it right, but it wasn't, and we can see the consequences of that where we are now. What's happened since? Now, okay, I'm not, but saying I'm not laying the blame on Putin. Actually, I lay the blame on I don't even lay the blame on Ukrainians. Actually, I lay the blame on the West. I mean, that's where I'm pointing the finger of blame at here. Actually, but yeah, but you were saying about intelligence officers. It's the same for historians. I'm not all historians, but I'm the kind of historian who works exactly on the basis that you described for intelligence officers. But look, I'm also a citizen. Yeah, I'm faced with a political kind of issue. So I have to, well, I don't have to. I could sit back and say, no, I'm a historian. I'm not going to dirty my hands with justification or judgment or making decisions and stuff like that. I could do that, but no, I have responsibilities as a citizen as well as a historian. So it's as a citizen, I'm kind of responding to the decision and thinking, well, do I agree with it? What do I think? What are the consequences of it? Were there alternatives? That's the way. And also, as a citizen, I feel an obligation to try and do something about the war in terms of doing everything I can to, influence public opinion in the direction of peace. Yeah, people, often think of me or accuse me of being, pro-Putin or pro-Russian, and my response is, I'm pro-peace. I'm a partisan of peace. That's my fundamental position on the war. I want the war to come to an end as soon as possible. A settlement, but a settlement that will actually, satisfy Russia's legitimate security interests, but also a settlement that will also guarantee Ukraine's future as an independent sovereign state. Although I have to say, the way the war is going at the moment, I actually have grave kind of concerns that Ukraine is actually going to survive. And in fact, Ukrainians are saying this themselves. Some Ukrainian politicians, they're saying themselves, the way the things are going, our counter-event, actually our statehood is at stake. And I think it is. I think we've got to the stage where Ukraine statehood is at stake.
I'd like to comment on that and applaud you, Jeffrey, because you could sit back, as you say, in your ivory tower and say, oh, well, I can talk about this in a historical way. But you see an overriding need to inform the populace, which has been terribly misinformed for reasons that you understand and that I understand. The general public does not understand it, but they kind of are pre-inclined to buy the legend. Now, what I want to ask you is this, and you don't have to answer if you don't want. You're Professor Emeritus, and if ever that title was deserved, it's deserved by you. Were you a professor, associate professor? Were you younger? Were you trying to make a career and get the privileges of having tenure? Would it be harder for you to speak out?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And the answer is absolutely yes. There's a lot of my younger colleagues, particularly those about tenure, those are trying to make a career for themselves, get promoted, get whatever recognition grants, get published and stuff like that. They're either huge kind of pressure to keep their mouths shut or to go, to conform to the party line on this. But yeah, I'm not sure how I would have responded had I still been in employment when the war broke out. Obviously, I'm not an emeritus. I could do what I want. There's very strong guarantees for freedom of speech in Ireland. I've certainly had my share of abuse as to what I said about the war, but there's been no attempt to muzzle me, silence me, or shut me up, or any threats of that nature. Yeah, so I'm in a very very privileged position in being able to speak out. Certainly, had I still been, there would have been restrictions on what I could do and say in relation. So, for example, had I still been working for University College Cork at a contract of employment, because of university policy, I wouldn't have been allowed to travel to Russia. Yeah, I've been to Russia. I was in Russia last autumn, Murmansk and Moscow, and indeed I'm going to Russia again in this autumn. A couple of I wouldn't have been able to do it. I'm going to Russia. Okay, there's conferences I'm going to, but also I'm going to as part of a project of, I don't agree with this trying to cancel Russia approach. I agree. We need to engage. We need to communicate. We need Russia. The West. Needs Russia to resolve common problems, and above all, we need Russia as partners in maintaining peace and avoiding nuclear extinction.
And how
exactly, yeah. And let me just add a comment here, if I may, Eddie, and that is that this Putin hatred, this being put in Putin's pocket. I run into that all the time, but I'm as free as you are. I'm not emeritus, nor do I deserve to be called emeritus, but I've been around for a half a century watching Russian politics, right? And so the worst thing that happens to me is my age. What happens when they go to the CIA and say, did this guy really brief presidents? Did he really lead the Soviet foreign policy branch at CIA? And what they say is, yeah, but he's old and he doesn't have access to classified information. Now, Geoff, you know better than anyone on this call that you don't have to have access to classified information to figure out what's going on with Putin. So last thing I'll just say here is that I was in Germany about 7 years ago, and I saw a button that said, Putin verstehe. I'm not sure you can see it here, but here it is. Putin verstehe. It means someone who understands Putin. And I said to my friend, oh, man, that's great. Give me one of those buttons. People are trying to understand where Putin's coming from. I said, no, you're sick. Don't do that. Don't do that. Said, why not? That's a pejorative. That will put you in Putin's pocket. But no. This is a derogatory thing. Don't try to be a Putin versteher. Don't try to understand Putin. And I said to my God, in Germany of all places. So that's the deal here. People are really up against it, and I am so glad, Jeffrey, that you're one of the few people in Ireland. I mean, the prospect of cluster munitions coming through Shannon just turns the hair on the back of my head on end. So you guys are neutral, huh? Are you really neutral? Give me a break. Sorry, I'll end there.
One of the things, yeah. So I just want to say that I'm trying to watch the time as well, and we need to make some time for people who might want some questions in the chat. And obviously, there's a tremendous amount after being covered, and some of the things that we might have wanted to cover more of, we simply are running out of time. However, the one thing I would like to come back to, because I know the danger of unanswered questions and what people turn them into. So the question I was asking, maybe this quick one before we go to the chat situation, is Russia committing large-scale atrocities and genocide in Ukraine? This is the narrative that we hear, and I'm just wondering what your opinion on that would be.
Yeah. Let me have a go at that one. Yeah, there's a couple of things I want to say about that, but just in general about Western media coverage of the war. It's they're not reporting the war; they're propagandizing the war. Mostly it's what you read in the press, here on the media. It's actually just propaganda. It's the only way to pro-Ukrainian propaganda. Now, it's not completely the case. There is good reporting, there's good analysis, and actually that good reporting and good analysis is getting better all the time. The media performance is improving. It's improving because the reality is dawning about what's actually happening in the war in Ukraine and what future is unfolding. And the future that's unfolding is that there's going to have to be some kind of negotiation, some kind of peace, some kind of settlement with Russia, or if not, okay, then we're into a situation of permanent conflict and permanent war, and nobody wants this. But an important point here about the media coverage. We're talking about Western media here. Western media propagandizing, right, about the war. It's not the same in the rest of the world. The press. The media coverage of the war in the rest of the world, in what's now called the global South, is completely different to what we see on our screens or read in our newspapers every day. It's much more even-handed. It's much more balanced. It's looking at it from different perspectives. If you want to get some decent perspectives, on the war, you should start, watching Al Jazeera more often, or watching the Chinese and Indian TV programs about the war, or those publications as well. So it's just in the West there's this propagandizing media. It's not the case in many other countries in the world. Okay, this atrocity question. Look. All wars, they're atrocities, right? Committed by both sides, and I'm certain that both Russians and Ukrainians have committed atrocities during the course of this war. Individuals and also units. Who's committed what atrocity? That's hard to say at the present time, because of course, all wars have atrocities, but all wars also have atrocity stories, atrocity-driven propaganda, right? And it's only after the conflict's over, many years after, and sometimes not even then, sometimes impossible, that we can actually arrive at a reasonable understanding as to what atrocities were committed by whom, by which side, and so on. But let me make this general point: is that what the way I see it is this, and it might seem a rather strange thing to me. I don't see any evidence of either side committing systematic, large-scale atrocities, right? Because I don't see the evidence of that actually happening. But also, if you look at the statistics on the civilian death toll in Ukraine, and the best source of these is that the United Nations keeps a running total of confirmed civilian tests. And the last time I looked, they had like 10,000 civilian deaths confirmed, which is a huge number. And they also say in the US, well, of course, that's just confirmed deaths. There's probably a lot more of them, and that's true. But if we take that as the baseline figure, actually, the number of civilian deaths in the war, given the scale of the war, the scale of the military action, the weaponry, the intensity, actually isn't that high. In the Iraq War, 2003, the British and Americans killed tens of thousands during the course of their initial civilians. I'm talking about military campaign. So we've had this, that's the ballpark figure, 10,000 plus, obviously. So I think that's actually evidence of both sides, actually with a good deal of restraint here in terms of civilian casualties. So there are huge casualties in Ukraine, hundreds of thousands of dead and wounded, but they're mainly civilian casualties. Now, having said that, that's not to kind of in any way underplay civilian suffering as a result as well, because it's not just a question about people getting killed, civilians, it's also being wounded, the mental trauma, being displaced, all these millions of it's a huge kind of like a huge civilian kind of toll, but actually it's actually quite limited given the scale of the war, and frankly so. It's one of the more hopeful things, because it's going to be very, very difficult to actually be very, very difficult to arrive at any kind of settlement of this war. It's going to be extremely difficult, even more difficult to arrive at any kind of like reconciliation between Russians and Ukrainians. But just imagine how difficult it would be if this story about large-scale civilian atrocities and genocide were being committed in the war were true. That story is not true. It's just more propaganda.
Yeah, very interesting. Sorry, Ray, do you want to say, or do we go straight?
Just very briefly. Again, I agree completely with Geoff. I would simply point out that almost all the sources that are used in Western media come from Ukraine, come from Kiev, come from Ukrainian propaganda outfits. And there are some incidents that are so atrocious, if you can talk about atrocious atrocities, that they beg real scrutiny. And I have in mind Bucha, the massacre in Bucha. When was that revealed? Right when the Istanbul negotiations fell apart and the Russians had to be demonized. It is far from clear that all those people in Bucha, Ukraine, were massacred by the Russians. It seems to me, and the evidence points directly to the Ukrainian Secret Service having taken those steps and blaming it on Russia. So sometimes there's a temporal relationship between the PR campaign coming out of Kiev and what they want to distract from. That is the successful up till the end negotiation of a ceasefire and a neutral Ukraine in Istanbul, which Geoff explained before.
Yeah, great. So just then, that's all very interesting, I find, from both of you, that response. So then, if we can just then move to see, are there any questions in the chat? So as people have an opportunity maybe to ask a question. And I'm just...
There's no chat.
No, there's no chats, right? So there aren't any questions. So I suppose then it's, if I can, then maybe we are close to bringing the whole event to a conclusion, which...
Can I just ask one last question? I want to ask Ray, actually, is that, how does he see the situation now in terms of the prospects of some kind of, not immediately, but in the next few months, say, some kind of ending to the war coming about, ceasefire or some kind of negotiations? How do you read the situation?
Geoff, I'm schizophrenic on it. I'm delighted that CNN and the Washington Post is saying now that, contrary to Biden's remark that Russia has already lost, and William Burns, head of the CIA's remark that the weakness of Russian military has been exposed for all to see, that's 180 degrees away from the situation now. Now, I'm not rooting for either side. I'm saying the facts are that the Ukrainian counteroffensive has failed. Got it? Failed. So what's next? That's where the schizophrenia comes in. I don't know what Biden, Blinken, Sullivan, and Nuland are going to do now. And doesn't matter that I don't know. Neither does Vladimir Putin, all right? He has said on many occasions that U.S. foreign and military policy is a function of domestic political requirements, period. Whoa, it's an election year, for God's sake. Not only that, not only are going to take care of Ukraine for as long as it takes, not only that, but these fellas, including Biden and his son Hunter, including Sullivan, who was responsible for Russiagate, including Blinken, who enlisted 51 intelligence officers to lie about Biden's laptop 2 weeks before the election. I'm trying to put myself in their position and say, my God, if Trump wins, we can go to jail. The evidence is out there. Now, what I'm saying here, there are personal reasons now. There's a personal stake in these fellows who are responsible for all this not losing. So the schizophrenia is, they're losing. Will they acknowledge it and go to negotiations? Or will it be too politically embarrassing so that they'll up the ante to include tactical nuclear weapons? I would not rule it out, and that's what scares me to hell. Thanks, Geoff, for asking.
Yeah, I think I share the schizophrenia. I suppose maybe I'd be a bit more optimistic that, well, like the realist voices in the administration and in other Western countries, also Western public opinion, could play a positive role in averting the kind of more like catastrophic scenarios that could emerge in the wake of the failure of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. But I think there's 2 points I'm fairly confident. One is that the Russians, Putin, will be prepared to call a ceasefire, have a settlement, providing the terms are right. It would mean territorial losses by Ukraine. It would mean all kinds of things, all kinds of concessions. But in response to that, I think that the Russians would be prepared to make concessions to Ukraine and the West, as long as their security position is protected, as long as the interests of pro-Russian Ukrainians, their interests are respected. So that gives me some, at least one side of the conflict, I think, is prepared to do diplomacy, deal, and have a peace. So thank God for that. But the other thing gives me hope is the role of the global South, China, India, Brazil, all they are a very, very significant voice in favor of peace. The rest or some kind of ending to the war. And I think, in the coming weeks and months, they could be an important voice in nudging, the Western side in the direction of, taking the political flag that's going to accompany any move towards peace negotiations with Russia, and also encouraging Putin and the Russians to make as many concessions as they can to Ukraine, including some territorial concessions as well to Ukraine and the Western side. So those two factors: the Russian willingness, Putin's willingness to do diplomacy, and the global South's potential role in that peace process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if I may just make one more comment, Eddie. I would say that any discussion like this would be remiss were it not to mention a country called China. Now, suffice it to say that the triangular relationship that used to exist with Russia, the US, and China in a sort of equilateral triangle now is, if you remember your geometry, an isosceles triangle. Right? You got two big sides, Russia and China against the US. US has the short end. It's not been like this before. It's 2 against 1. Now, how does that play out? Well, I'll just add this, and I usually add it before. That is this. We talked about December 2021. We talked about the key decision-making in January, but mostly in February of 2022. What did Putin do on the 4th of February 2022? He went to Beijing. They signed an agreement where their relationship was described as having no upper limits, okay? And I can't verify this because I wasn't a fly on the wall, but my notion is that Putin said to Xi Jinping, look, I know Chinese policy is against invading other countries, but here are grievances, and I may have to go into Ukraine. What do you think? My notion is Xi Jinping looked at me and says, you mean after the Winter Olympics are over, right? Oh, yeah, right. Well, the Olympics are over on the 21st, on the 20th of February, 2002. Try to remember those charts. Putin makes that big speech on the 21st. They recognize Lugansk and Donetsk. On the 23rd, the parliament agrees on all this, and on the 24th, the invasion takes place. Now, there's a rhetorical or a logical kind of unwise way to proceed, and that is post hoc ergo propter hoc. Okay, just because something happens after something doesn't mean that it happened because of it. But I leave it to your imagination. Look what happened on the 20th, the end of the Winter Olympics in Beijing. 21st, we know what happened there. I put in those graphs, 22nd, 23rd, 24th. So I think that had something to do with it. In a word, it's 2 against 1, folks. And that, I think, has given Putin the extra confidence that he had in doing something that surprised me. Okay, I admit, I didn't think he was going to invade Ukraine. And I think that provided the additional reassurance that he could do this because he had a big brother at his back. Big brother's name is China.
And yeah, and just to mention that actually we do have two comments in the chat that have come in. And first one, I just wanted to, it's an interesting question. And the questioner is asking, do either Geoff or Ray have any view on the extent to which either neo-Nazi battalions or the alleged American-operated biolabs motivated Putin's actions? Is the question.
Certainly the Russian perception, Putin's perception, was the growing neo-Nazi and ultra-nationalist influence in Ukraine, and particularly the battalions. And these battalions were actually being progressively integrated into Ukraine armed forces. And this is what Putin said, what Shoigu said before the war, when they're discussing what's going on, is that they're identifying the increasing influence of these neo-Nazi military formations, battalions within Ukrainian armed forces. What they're saying is, what they're worried about is that they're going to be in a position where at some point in the future they're going to be able to stage some kind of provocation aimed at the Donbass or against Crimea, and possibly, if at that time Ukraine is a member of NATO or fully integrated in NATO, it could actually, precipitate some kind of broader Russian-NATO conflict. So what Putin sees as being at stake in the confrontation and conflict with Ukraine over the Donbass, it's not just about a Donbass or about Russia and Ukraine. It's also the wider picture he's got in mind in terms of the future danger of a Russia, a NATO war, a war that might take place in conditions which he thought would be very unfavourable to Russia, a war in which you'd have this very, very strong militarized anti-Russia Ukraine on Russia's doorstep as the vanguard of any kind of this kind of military conflict. So so I think certainly the perception of the neo-Nazi, particularly the neo-Nazi militaristic influence, is very, very important in shaping Putin and the Russian side's thinking about the situation in Ukraine.
Do you want to say something, Ray, on that?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just add that we all knew about the Nazis by reading the New York Times. Oh, but that was 4 years ago. That was 3 years ago. The Nazi influence in Kiev has been airbrushed out of Western reporting for the last 2 years. I leave it to you all to make your decision as to what that means.
Yes,
I predict that it will make a comeback in the Western media. If you get some kind of like ceasefire, peace negotiations, a kind of shift in Western policy, then the Western media is going to rediscover all these nasty neo-Nazis and ultras in Ukraine, right? And use that as a reason for guiding the direction of peace rather than for continuing to fight the war. But we'll see. That's the only prediction I'm prepared to make on this program. On this video.
I hope that prediction. I hope it's a very interesting prediction, and I hope it's right, Geoff. So there's the comment here. I think it's quite an interesting one as well. I am shocked that the West seems to have an agenda to bring Russia and its peoples to its knees. Why do they want to do this? They seem to be treating this great country and its people's history and culture with disdain. As Geoff mentioned, they seem to want to cancel Russia. Ultimately, this policy is not good for anyone, anywhere going forward. So,
yeah, listen, I'm shocked. That's probably the thing that shocks me most about the whole war as well, actually. But here's the thing: those kind of elements, those kind of people, those kind of ambitions in relation to to Russia have always been around. Yeah, always been agitated. Always pushing in a particular direction. We're talking about the role of NATO expansion. One reason, the thing about NATO expansion is that, okay, Russia didn't like it, but it really didn't like it when NATO expansion became anti-Russia expansionism. And one of the reasons it became anti-Russia expansionism because, of course, you had all these new members of NATO, Baltic states, Poland, other countries, which began to exert their influence within NATO and helped turn the organisation in an anti-NATO direction. So that those people, that possibility was always there. But here's the thing: it's another problem I have about Putin's decision to go to war is that Putin's invasion, the war came out, empowered these extremist elements on the Western side who are these Russophobes and these very hostile elements who want to destroy Russia, destroy its culture, destroy its civilization. The regime changes. The war has given them their opportunity to actually exert their influence, and that's one of the things that talking about the schizophrenia that does concern me is that when push comes to shove, it maybe those kind of extremists might be the more influential factor as far as Western foreign policy is concerned, or Western policy is concerned, rather than the more realistic, pragmatic elements on the Western side.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Ray, do you want to say something just in ending then, before we bring it to a close?
Well, yes, sure. I have studied a lot of what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has said, preached, and lived. And I have a favorite quote from his famous letter from the Birmingham City Jail, which has to do with what we're all about today, what Geoff has so bravely done in his circumstances in Ireland, and what I'm trying to do here in the United States. It's the matter of exposing the truth to the broad public. What King was talking about in his letter from the Birmingham City Jail was the need to expose injustice and lies. And let me see if I can remember what he said. He compared it to a boil, okay? Maybe as adolescents you've had boils, you know what that is, okay? He said, like a boil that can never be cured unless it is opened up with all its pus-flowing ugliness to the natural medicines of air.